Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Joy from Strong-Hearted Native Women's Coalition. We are here today with Cibonay Jimenez speaking about sexual assault in Native communities. Cibonay Jimenez, formerly Cordova, has over 20 years of professional experience in the public health, education, domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, mental health, social services, healthcare, substance abuse, and social justice fields. Cibonay's passion for this work derives from her rich history and experience as a trauma, domestic violence, sexual assault survivor, and Native Kazan, Jimenez, and Yaqui Chicana woman. Currently, she works for the California State Domestic Violence Coalition and is a lecturer at CSU Channel Islands. She previously held the position of Chief Program Officer at WEAVE, one of the largest domestic violence sexual assault agencies in the U.S. At WEAVE, Cibonay oversaw various programs, which included the 24-hour support and information line, residential programs, domestic violence response team, sexual assault response team, counseling, anti-trafficking programs, prevention and education, and crisis response. Prior to working at WEAVE, she held the position of the Community Services Director at the Sacramento Native American Health Charter for 8 years and managed prevention, intervention, treatment, aftercare programs for domestic violence and sexual assault, health disparities, mental health, among others. Cibonay has also been an independent consultant for 20 years, providing technical assistance and training for organizations, states, tribes, and networks. Outside of her professional capacity, Cibonay loves being a wife and a mom and loves nature. So thank you, Cibonay, for joining us, and thank you, everybody, for signing on. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn off my camera, and if you need me, just let me know.
Thank you so much, Joy. I'm Linda from Strong-Hearted Native Women's Coalition. As Joy mentioned, my name is Cibonay Jimenez, and my people are Yaqui Casamomares, and I'm also Chicana. And so I live every day that intersection between multi-identities. And so I kind of wanted to just acknowledge that as a Native woman working within both of those communities and the intersections of all of that. I wanted to start off today with, a brief land acknowledgement. I know that in all of the virtual spaces that I've been in and over the last couple of months, I've had some feedback and people, say, well, this is land acknowledgements are things we do, when we're in person. And I really kind of reflected upon that and thought about it. I'm like, no, land acknowledgements should exist regardless of whether we're having to meet virtually or not. And so I just wanted to kind of, again, take a second to acknowledge, the land that we are on, regardless of where you're dialing in from, and acknowledging that, those Native peoples throughout California, and I don't know if we have anybody dialing in outside of California, but, they, the original caretakers are Native peoples of, the state and continue to be, right, and continue to have that connection with the land. And so I just wanted to thank those people, those tribes personally, for allowing me to be here as a Native woman from outside of California. And then I wanted to kind of, with all transparency, I am a true believer of transparent facilitation. And, when in preparing this presentation, I had included some videos and audio. And as we were testing right before we started the webinar, it so happens that I'm not going to be able to share those, which is completely fine. I believe that things happen for a reason, and that's okay. But I did want to then, what I'll do is I will then talk about what would have been in those video clips. And then I will also provide links in the PowerPoint to them that you will receive later on at the end of the week. Okay, so I'm gonna just kind of, again, if I like to be transparent, I want to make sure that I try to cover everything that I had intended to talk about and whatever else needs to come up. Okay, so moving on, for workshop objectives, I wanted to make sure that, that this was more of a conversation, and I know that becomes more and more difficult when we are in virtual spaces. And so I don't want it to feel as if I'm talking at you, and I want to acknowledge that this presentation has really been developed with many voices, both from mentors of mine and communities that I've worked with and survivors. So, you know, I don't deem myself the carrier of all this knowledge necessarily, but I'm here today to share with you. And, you know, those objectives of being just talking about sexual assault, right? And kind of the history of sexual assault response teams, particularly in tribal communities. I feel that it is becoming more and more important that we have these conversations and that we have a space to where we can talk about the different connections and intersectionality and how they impact our communities. And then, you know, to offer some you know, key aspects and examples, some statistics. Again, we'll talk a little bit about some of the problems with statistics, and then some tools, right? And just having some conversation and a platform to ask questions. Joy read my bio, and this is one of the, had wanted to show one of my personal digital stories that talks about kind of a little bit of who I am. But what I wanted to kind of relay from that video that we aren't able to see is that, you know, I am a presenter today, but I have a history of many things, including being a woman of color, a Native woman, being a survivor of domestic violence, not only experiencing it and witnessing as a child, but also being in a relationship, a domestic violence relationship also. I am also a sexual assault survivor. And in this digital story that I was going to show you, it's sometimes easier to play something and, you know, let things be disclosed in that way. But I also think it's important that I want to mention those things because it very much does impact my perspective and the work that I do. A lot of the work that I do and the advocacy that I push for is a result of, you know, the inadequate services that I received as a child and teenager with my own sexual assault experiences. And so again, with that passion and desire to have other survivors experience something better, something different, something appropriate is kind of where I come from. So I'm going to kind of just skip over. That's what the black is, kind of those videos, but so I apologize for that. And again, so I wanted to kind of, again, I put the land acknowledgement on here, but I always wanted to do that. I always want to do that before everything else. I also wanted you guys, you know, throughout the presentation, you know, this beginning part, to put your name and your tribe and your program name or whatever in the chat, because I want to know who you are. And again, these virtual spaces are a little bit limiting, but I can read who you are and kind of feel like I'm in community with you. And it also gives me a little bit of awareness on about who's on the call, and so that if, you know, if there's a particular program or perspective that I'm familiar with, or a particular role that some of you are in, I can kind of speak more to that. So if you want to just kind of start doing that, I'll, you know, be able to pull that up on my other screen a little bit and look at that as well. And then I wanted to also take a couple of moments to really name and acknowledge that when I had agreed to be a presenter for this, you know, a lot of different things. I mean, COVID was happening because we, you know, Strong Hearted Native Women's Coalition knew that they were going to have to switch to kind of a virtual platform, but we weren't necessarily quite in, you know, the what's currently going on in our world in terms of fighting against racism, right? And I want to acknowledge that because it has been a rough several weeks with working and providing technical assistance to domestic violence and sexual assault organizations that are also struggling with the clear intersections between sexual assault, domestic violence, violence against women, and COVID-19 and fighting against racism. So within our Native communities, I'm a consultant also, so I have several contracts with tribes and Johns Hopkins University, where I work with tribes throughout the United States, and there are a lot of tribes struggling. And some of those reasons are the disparities and, how COVID is impacting Native communities at a disproportionate rate. There's the piece of re-traumatizing for Natives. When you look at disease and historical trauma, a lot of that is connected. And then, fighting against racism, right? This fight and the experiences that we have as Indigenous people is not new. And so again, when we're working with sexual assault survivors specifically, a lot of times those survivors are also collectively experiencing these other things that is interconnected with their healing as a survivor of sexual assault. So again, I wanted to name them and acknowledge that there is clear connection, and that it is important that as providers and as advocates that we are also constantly thinking about those connections, constantly thinking at the root problems as opposed to the symptoms that we see each day. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. On this next slide, it is blacked out because there was going to be a video or a vignette created by SACUI. SACUI is the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health. And I have a small contract with them doing some domestic violence work and some cultural responsive work for California. And I really enjoy this animated vignette because it is a great video that's several minutes long, but it's a great video that I've used as a tool within Native communities, among Native youth, even at families. I work with home visitors or in-home services, and it's a great vignette to show families to kind of spark conversation about sexual assault and violence against Native women. So this vignette talks about the historical experience with violence against women. It talks about colonization. It talks about kind of, that connection between intergenerational trauma and so forth. So I will provide the links in the PowerPoint so that you can access them later and view them on your own. I also wanted to bring into the space a couple of centering principles, and these are both taken from the network. It's called the Network Weavers Learning Collaborative, and this is a leadership program that I went through with several other colleagues throughout California. It was funded by Blue Shield, and we created this card deck that has different principles and values and things that can be utilized by advocates. And I will also include this in the PowerPoint packet. But two things that I wanted to highlight from this card deck for today, and it was kind of going to fall after that video, animated vignette. Again, those practices of oppression and liberation, and kind of really looking at root causes with regards to white supremacy, patriarchy, racism, and all of that exists in this country, and looking at how do we rebalance that, right? And when we're working with specifically with sexual assault, and among other things, because we know that when we're working with someone, we're not just working with their experience as a sexual assault survivor, we're looking at how do we address that trauma, and then how do we open up avenues for healing? How do we rebalance that, right? And I know that historically, Native peoples come from that perspective, right? They have that perspective in terms of how do you maintain balance? How do you restore balance? And then the other one was, again, the systems and intersections principle that, everything we do and experience are connected, right? And so when we're looking at an individual's experience as a sexual assault survivor, it is really our jobs to look at them holistically as a person, as their collective experience as a person, as well as their experience as that, as a victim of sexual assault. Okay, so just a quick overview of sexual assault. I know that, when we talk about sexual violence or violence against women or even sexual assault, a lot of times those are umbrella terms. Sometimes we use them interchangeably, and it really just kind of depends on the language. Oops, excuse me. It really just depends on the language within even our programs, right? And when we talk about language, you know, some of us will use survivor and victim interchangeably. Others will use victim for someone who has not reached that healing point, right? So again, just being cognizant of those different different types of language and how we use them is going to be important. So for some definition, I wanted to just kind of read these. So sexual assault is experienced as a physical and psychological traumatic intrusion to the body and spirit of a person. And I know when I started doing this work 20 years ago or 20 plus years ago, you know, this definition was, you know, it didn't acknowledge the psychological, the spiritual, the emotional piece of this type of violence, right? Instead, it focused on the physical piece of it. And so over the years, we have learned that it is more impactful than just the physical piece. Sometimes survivors are exposed to near-death experience, both in reality and in perception. And that's really important to understand because, again, it is not us who get to determine whether or not that was a near-death experience with regards to that person's healing. It is, sexual assault is experienced differently among every person. And as advocates and those implementing programs, it is important for us to have not only be able to hold the if and at the same time of our knowledge of something not necessarily in reality being near death, but then also at the same time being able to actually understand it as a real near death experience for that person. Sexual assault survivors can experience a complete loss of control over their lives. Again, looking at how this impacts someone in all realms of someone's life. A lot of times we see that, and the sexual assault can be minimized. And again, as we talk a little bit more throughout the PowerPoint, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, so I'm not going to read through all of these just because of time, but I wanted to kind of go over those first few. But the other one I wanted to emphasize is that, again, it is our job to help survivors feel empowered again, and so that the sexual assault doesn't become a life-defining event, right? It's something that is that there is healing, and although it will not be forgotten, it will not necessarily define who they are. And then finally, we will talk about SART later on, which is sexual assault response teams, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are. Okay, so different types of sexual violence. Again, I wanted to make sure that, you know, that people didn't walk away thinking that sexual assault or sexual violence was just one thing. A lot of times when we talk about sexual violence, people instantly kind of think about rape, right? They think about penetration. And I want to make sure that that there is a clearer understanding that it is more than that. And we kind of lump everything under sexual violence, sexual assault. But here are a list of some types of sexual violence. So again, I don't want anyone to assume that these are it. There are other types as well, but some of them are sexual assault. So under sexual violence, some of them are sexual assault, some of, you know, child sexual abuse, sexual assault of men and boys. We have intimate partner sexual violence. So those of you doing kind of domestic violence and sexual assault work see that quite often. We have incest, drug facilitated sexual assault. So again, many, many different types, and there are more. So looking at some of the statistics, you know, I work at a mainstream organization for my job, and then I work as a contractor / consultant for many other projects. And primarily my consultant work is working with Native communities. So I kind of get to see statistics in very different ways. You know, for the partnership, I get to see statistics kind of like from a mainstream organizational perspective, kind of a breakdown of many, many different races and cultures. And then for my other work, I get to kind of delve into how things are specifically impacting different communities, Native communities. And so I'm going to go over some statistics and kind of highlight a couple of things, but I also very much want to keep in mind and people to know that that I also understand that there are limitations to numbers and statistics, right? And some of those limitations include, you know, inaccurate reporting, which is huge, not only in general, but specifically for Native communities. And so I want to acknowledge that. So all of this data, while we're looking at it and trying to make meaning of it, it's also important to acknowledge that there are probably quite a bit of underreporting for a lot of this, right? And that's one of the main things that we have noticed and have seen, and we get to use that data to advocate and to, you know, ask for additional resources and funding so that we can kind of fill those gaps of what is being underreported, right? But I wanted to acknowledge that. I also wanted to acknowledge that, you know, not only is there underreporting, but there are other barriers in terms of cultural barriers to receiving data and so forth. So this statistic, again, I'm not going to read through every single piece on the slides, but you'll get them later. But I did want to kind of emphasize, you know, this is pulled from a report from 2016 from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And, you know, it mentions that more than half, so 56.1% have experienced violence for Native women, right? And so we're looking at over half of Native women have experienced some kind of sexual violence. It also said that, you know, over half have endured physical violence by an intimate partner. And, you know, it has a similar rate for stalking. And so I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, while we have other data that shows lower rates for non-Native people, we also know that some communities, these numbers have been reported even higher, right? And then taking into account that things are underreported in general, you know, kind of that might give us an idea of what these numbers actually are like. It also gives us some information about who needed medical care. So again, the severity, data does show us that the severity increases for Native women specifically. And so those that are having to go to hospitals or seek medical attention or have longer lasting medical treatment needs as a result of the assault is much higher for Native women. Okay, so this, you know, again, looking at statistics, this on the right, you have like an infographic from SACUI, again, the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health, and it mentions that, you know, 65% of urban Indian women have experienced interpersonal violence, and then it breaks it down. It says 48% has experienced sexual assault, right? So again, we're looking at more than, you know, about half, and then the other one said more than half. And then if we take into account that underreporting, you know, we can assume that it is higher than that. For survivors of sexual assault, we also, again, these other numbers give us a little bit of information about, you know, how many have experienced childhood physical abuse, right? How many have witnessed domestic violence, right? And things like that on different infographics and different data tables, we can pull that information. And so again, looking at what root causes are, looking at how compound trauma and you know, all of those things kind of play into somebody's story. Here are a couple of other infographics from SACUI. You know, 1 in 3 Native women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. You know, there's some controversy, of course, in terms of, you know, are most of these perpetrators or those that do harm, are they Native? Are they not Native? This, you know, this study actually shows that, you know, 86% of them are actually done by non-Native perpetrators. And this is, I want to acknowledge that SACUI is focusing on urban tribal people, right? Urban Natives. And so again, in California, there's a very diverse platform of rural Native communities, tribal communities, and urban areas. And that has been one of the challenges also for data, is to make sure that we are accurately reporting you know, those numbers for all of those types of communities, right? And we also know that California is home to many Natives outside of California tribes. So again, looking at all of that, it kind of makes it a little more difficult to kind of assess the data. But it is important to look at what we do have. The other infographic says that being physically or sexually abused makes teen girls 6 times more likely to become pregnant and twice as likely to get an STI. So you're looking at a sexually transmitted infection or getting pregnant. And again, looking at intersectionality and the connection between our work as sexual assault advocates or program implementers or responders, it is important to understand the repercussions and the long-term impacts and effects that that sexual assault has on people. So this table, again, pulled from another data source, but again, it looks at different types of sexual assault. So sexual assault with penetration, other sexual violence. You're looking at sexual coercion. Within Native communities, I've done a lot of work with reproductive justice. So looking at, again, sexual coercion, looking at, all of those different areas that fall under reproductive justice. And so these are just some numbers. Again, I'm not going to go over every single one of them, but it does compare it to, American Indian or Alaska Native with non-Hispanic whites. And you can kind of see some slight differences. With penetration, you see a 15%, and it kind of is smaller in some of the other areas. But again, looking at severity and the data that we just looked at before in terms of needing medical attention and so forth, and those of you who are already doing SART or examinations and advocacy in that, I'm pretty sure you can kind of understand that correlation between those numbers. In terms of sex trafficking in tribal communities, this is another report. And again, looking at the interconnection between just violence against Native women in general, you're looking at domestic violence, sexual violence, you're looking at sex trafficking, you're looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women. So all of these numbers become very relevant, and this kind of just highlights some of those numbers for sex trafficking. It says 40% of individuals involved in sex trafficking identified themselves as American Indian. So think about that, like 40% of those individuals involved in sex trafficking identified themselves as American Indian. That's huge, right? That's huge. And again, looking at what our communities are doing to address this, I think is increasing, but we have a lot of work to do still. And so I will be sending these reports with the PowerPoint as well. Again, missing and murdered Indigenous women. I know that there's been a lot of activism and great work going on in the recent years. I put these kind of infographics from Urban Indian Health Institute, and I acknowledge that there are many other entities and tribes working on this in California. So I don't want to minimize that, but I also wanted to acknowledge that this report was actually implemented in response to data that that was done nationally that gave numbers that were obviously inaccurate, and it identified, and the Urban Indian Health Institute then acknowledged huge gaps within that data collection. And so this was kind of like the outcome, and looking at at data, in terms of a crisis, and looking at how we need to work better at getting at least some better data so that we can know how to respond, and we can provide more advocacy in this area. But I also know, in California, we have a lot of tribes that I've worked with specifically that are also doing this work and are working on getting more current and accurate numbers as well. So again, we know, that there are limitations to data, and one of those is barriers to reporting, right? So I wanted to kind of just go over this. When you're looking at reporting sexual abuse, it's really a personal decision, right? It's up to each survivor to decide whether or not they report. And some decide in that moment and it's kind of an instant decision. Others, sometimes it is later down the road. And for others, it's never reported, right? And for those who have experienced abuse, have reported that there are numerous barriers to reporting, right? And so this information was primarily taken from Native women who actually ended up reporting, but either didn't right away or hesitated greatly. And so some of the feedback that was given with this report is that, as a survivor, there are feelings of shame and guilt and embarrassment, right? And that there are oftentimes feelings that aren't able to just go away, and a lot of that can oftentimes from things that the world is doing, that we are doing, that mass media is doing, that our communities are doing, our programs. And so it is important, as we're looking at eliminating and reducing barriers, that we look at what survivors are telling us, and so that we can make sure that we are not perpetuating those feelings of shame and guilt and embarrassment, right? Something else that was mentioned is that there was a perceived negative consequence of reporting. And I would say that, instead of it being perceived, that there is a negative consequence of reporting for them. And a lot of times that is a real reality when they are working with law enforcement, when they are working even with sexual assault programs. And so that negative consequence oftentimes can kind of play a role in terms of a barrier to reporting. Oftentimes there's fear of retaliation by the person who did harm. There's sometimes financial dependence on that person. Again, depending on what type of sexual violence we are talking about, that can look very differently. And so again, keeping in mind and recognizing that every survivor's story is very different. And for that reason, we work in a system of gray area. I managed and oversaw advocates for many, many years, and a lot of times they would say, Cibonay, I just want things to be black or white. I want us to have a policy that can, tell me how to address this as it comes up. And I would always say, my response was always like, the only thing I promise you is that that will never be the case, right? As long as we're doing that work, and of course our job is to work, to work ourselves out of a job. But right now, while we're doing this, like that will not be the case. Our job is to work within the gray. And so, again, looking at other barriers, not wanting family members or friends to be prosecuted. So again, that feeling of shame, or that feeling of having to protect the person who did harm. Oftentimes, disbelief, right? People not believing, maybe someone initially discloses to a family member, yet they're not believed. So then, that becomes a barrier to reporting to, law enforcement or to the clinic and so forth. Lack of resources is a big one, especially in, in rural areas. A lot of times we have communities who maybe have a resource, right? So maybe the tribal clinic is the resource, or maybe there is a sexual assault organization as a resource, but that there's only one. And sometimes what happens with that is that that one option, maybe your cousin works there, or maybe the perpetrator's, auntie works there, or maybe, you're on tribal council and you don't want that to, to be known. And so there's a lot of different things, especially when we're working with tribal communities and rural areas, that, the lack of resource or having limited resources becomes big in reporting. Of course, there's the distrust of the criminal justice system and hospitals and medical systems, right? As Native peoples, I remember my grandparents saying, hospitals are places that you go to die. And, that is very much embedded in the historical experience that they have lived through and the stories that are in our family. And the same thing with the criminal justice system, right? When you look at, child welfare, when you look at law enforcement, not always have we had positive experiences with those systems. So it definitely plays into whether or not we really want to interact with them as survivors. And so those again, and then like cultural and language barriers. One thing that, my digital story talks a lot about is that when I was getting help as a young girl and as a teenager in different occasions, is that, you know, providers couldn't understand the very complex spiritual piece, right? I've grown up in, you know, with Native ways, and that's all I know. And so to be able to also, you know, I remember talking about my coming of age ceremony, right? And that people not understanding why that was so important at this time that I had been violated, right? And so those are some things that, again, when you're feeling stigmatized or you're feeling misunderstood, or you know, all of those will kind of play into whether or not somebody actually reports. Okay. Effects of sexual assault, you know, looking at sexual violence and trauma impacts. I put this up here because I wanted to just kind of, again, reiterate that it is important that, you know, to understand that every person who experiences sexual assault experiences it in their own worldview, in their own walk, right? In mainstream organizations and society, sometimes we're forced to compartmentalize and kind of box things up, right? So I remember in early positions earlier in my professional life, you know, being told that, you know, it didn't matter that I was a Native woman or that I was a mom or any of that, you know, with my professional capacity within my job. And what I've learned, again, is as I go through my professional life, like my personal life and my personal values, my tribal values are very much important in the work that I do. And that, you know, and so knowing that and knowing that any sexual assault survivor has those other pieces, those other components, that we have to acknowledge them, right? And so when you're looking at someone who, for example, is seeking counseling, if someone is seeking counseling and that therapist refuses to talk about or, you know, ask about, you know, the cultural piece, or ask about the, you know, other world views, you know, then we're really doing a disservice, right? And again, this is not black or white. You know, there are some people who won't want to talk about that, but if we don't feel that there should be a space for it, then we are doing a disservice to our client. A lot of times our experience of anything traumatic, well, always our experience of anything traumatic, we're gonna be impacted as a result of our history, our experience, you know, the knowledge that we have, right? So what information do we have? And, you know, for that reason, I'm a strong believer that, you know, it is very important that survivors get what they need at the moment that they need it. One of the problems with sexual assault response historically has been that it has been too late or at the wrong time. And so then we lose that opportunity to help that survivor for what they need and want in that moment. And so that is kind of, again, looking at how we can look at areas of disconnect that have you know, historically been the case within sexual assault response, and then, you know, trying to fill that gap, trying to fix it so that we can do better. This video was going to be, it's called Native Women Speak Out About Sexual Assault, and it was kind of a survivor story of a Native woman, and looking at how and why she did not report originally, and looking at her healing story and kind of her experience. So again, I will share the link later. Okay, so we're looking at, you know, what is our job as advocates? Like, what do we need to be doing? And, you know, one of those things is reiterating and supporting the rights of sexual assault victims, right? And so a lot of times doing this work, oftentimes people outside of our field or this field will say, well, how do we know we can believe them, right? How do we know that that is true? How do we know it happened, right? And, you know, one of the rights of sexual assault victims is that they have the right to be believed, right? And so, and when you look at data and stories, and both qualitative and quantitative, you see that most often, you know, these stories are true. Very, 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 very rarely is there someone who is creating these stories, right? And if you think about it, you know, why if there's so much stigma involved, there's so much, you know, victim blaming and all of that, like, you know, think about why somebody would even want to, you know, make up something like this, right? And a lot of times the story that we're hearing, the disclosure, the reporting, a lot of times it's minimized. So a lot of times as survivors, we're not sharing the details of things, right? So again, you know, it's our job to really support someone and to believe them. It's our job to make them feel safe, right? You know, to aid in that process of them feeling safe, feeling supported. They have the right to heal, right? Again, so that incident is not defining them, right? And so that they are able to make connections in terms of what resources and information they need in order to have access to them, but then also to kind of work on that healing journey. To have a sense of justice, you know, and this is going to look differently for every survivor, right? I've worked with survivors that, you know, justice looks like, you know, actually utilizing the criminal justice system, right? And, you know, going that route. And I've worked with survivors where justice looks like more restorative, right? More kind of, you know, resetting the balance within their tribal community. And so you're looking at ways to restore that balance, ways to take accountability, right? And so again, when I say that sense of justice, again, knowing that that looks very differently for every single survivor. So again, their right to be re-empowered to make their own choices. I know a lot of what I hear from advocates is also like, well, they shouldn't do that, or I wouldn't have done that. And you know, again, it's really important for us to take a step back and, you know, out of our own perspective and make sure that we're allowing them to make their own choices, right? And feeling that power and that control again over their life after something that has basically disintegrated their control, right? You know, and it's our job to provide education, to provide resources so that they have options and good information to make informed choices, right? So those two kind of go connected. And then, you know, again, they have the right to have these rights protected. So again, as advocates, you know, when we see these rights being challenged in different areas of the criminal justice system, the medical examination, you know, all within our own organizations, it's important that we make sure our policies are aligned with making sure that these rights of sexual assault victims is being upheld. Some other needs for sexual assault victims, again, you know, these look very differently depending on who you're working with and what community, but for the most part, again, I mentioned it before, is like I'm a strong believer that, you know, we have the opportunity to meet someone's need at the moment that they need it. And that involves a coordinated and effective response, right? It involves a rapid medical assessment if that's what they want, including evaluation and treatment. That includes sensitive intervention, cultural competency and humility, right? So not only understanding diverse cultures and having empathy, but also having that humility piece of letting them take the lead of the expert of their own life and their own needs. Early crisis intervention, as well as emotional support and advocacy. Again, our role to provide information about the investigative and, you know, the processes and the procedures. You know, for myself, I mentioned, you know, as a survivor of domestic violence, like I remember going through all of the court stuff and all of the child custody stuff and, you know, all of those pieces. And I have a master's degree, and it was difficult and confusing. And you know, couldn't imagine not being able to read well or not being able to kind of navigate those systems, because believe me, it was difficult for myself, which is why I try so hard to help the survivors that come to me, right? Those that I'm advocating for, because I do know and understand that those processes are very, very confusing, and they're not easy to understand. They're very difficult to navigate. So again, it becomes our role to help and assist with that process, right? Again, to provide accessibility, this is kind of focusing a little bit on the forensic piece, but again, having those resources for those who want to proceed with a forensic examination. Other things is, again, when you're looking at sexually transmitted diseases and you're looking at mental health, again, the advocacy and the support doesn't stop after that initial crisis response. Looking at long-term case management, looking at aftercare, and so forth is going to be important. And then, at some point, obviously, we're hoping that this process and that, empowerment, the, having a sense of justice and all of those things, the healing will have some closure for the survivor. So I'm not going to go over this slide, but I did want to kind of just mention that, the criminal justice system, and I know that there are many diversities with what this looks like in terms of within California, when you have tribal courts and tribal law enforcement, and then you have state jurisdictions and different penal codes come into place. So I don't want to go into this deeply, but I also just wanted to acknowledge that, it is very complex in terms of the criminal justice system. And, program people and advocates are confused. And so I can understand, why survivors are confused also. But, again, for some survivors, the criminal justice system is a choice. And so being able to understand it, being able to be competent in, what that investigatory process looks like, and, all of those different pieces, it's going to be important so that we can help support the survivor through their, testimony, through their filings and everything, right? So, and, acknowledge that, the criminal justice system doesn't have the same role as we do as advocates. And that's something that sometimes is difficult because, again, we're working as advocates, we are working as supporters of survivors, and the criminal justice system's role is not necessarily that, right? Again, there are advocates within the criminal justice system, but again, they don't hold privilege the same, they don't hold the same role with regards to the survivor's healing and moving forward, right? This is, again, looking at the criminal justice system. Well, for some survivors, it is important that they proceed, within this avenue. It's also important that sometimes this system can be very traumatic. It can be sometimes even more traumatic than the sexual assault experience, right? And so not only can it be traumatic for that survivor, but it can also be traumatic for that survivor's family, the community, and again, keeping that in mind so that we can appropriately respond to that trauma. There are a lot of flaws in the system, right? There's a lot of such lack of evidence, whether or not things are reported, testimonies, all of that. And again, it gets complicated. I've worked with tribes where there's jurisdiction issues, right? So pieces of the case have been transferred, right? And, and things like that. So, so looking at different, I wanted to kind of just mention again, I'm not going to read, all of, legislation with regards to VAWA, but I did want to mention that, when we look at advocacy and we look at policy and we look at even the protesting, right? And, the demanding of more legislation, looking at this specifically for Indian people. I wanted to kind of mention VAWA because, in 1994, VAWA was passed, and it is really the first piece of legislation, at the federal level that is addressing domestic violence and sexual assault as crimes, right? So you're looking at, it's not too long ago, and then you have these various reauthorizations. In 2005, there is language that actually addresses it within Indian country, right? Again, there's definitely flaws within that reauthorized piece, but they're starting to recognize the needs. And then with the recent VAWA reauthorization discussion and so forth, there's even more tribal protections and funding and stuff. So again, and then in 2010, looking at the Tribal Law and Order Act, that was really enacted to help the federal government better address those experiences with tribal communities, right, with regards to violence against women, sexual violence. And so here, you know, again, we're looking at policy, right? And so one of our jobs is to continue to be not necessarily the voice of survivors and their experience, but to kind of take the information that we're learning and take it, you know, to the federal government, taking it to their state. And, you know, in some of that work, you know, I don't specifically do the policy work at the partnership, but, you know, a lot of that work is being carried forward by colleagues of mine that are working really hard to make sure that tribal peoples are included in a lot of the policy advocacy that we're doing. Okay, the other thing I wanted to, you know, not everybody knows that, you know, that sexual assault advocates and sexual assault response teams are actually embedded in law. So, you know, per penal code, and this is, you know, the penal code that that it states that, you know, that these are formally established and they are legal entities of sexual assault response. Okay, so again, looking at what is sexual assault response teams, what is SAFE, what is SANE. A lot of times I have to be very careful that I don't constantly throw out acronyms, just because sometimes I make the assumption that, you know, everybody knows what they are, and a lot of times people don't, right? And so what is a sexual assault response team? Basically, it's a multidisciplinary interagency sexual assault intervention model comprised of public and private agencies, right? So you're looking, it's not necessarily just the forensic team, but it's all people that are doing that crisis response. So you're looking at advocates, you're looking at tribes, you're looking at, you know, what all of the different pieces, not only at, you know, within a tribe or in urban areas, you know, sometimes there are community health centers and so forth. But then also the other public and private agencies that will intersect at different times. Sexual assault the sexual assault forensic examiner, or also known as like the SAFE, they'll call them sometimes this, you know, SAFE or SANE nurse, right? So sexual assault nurse examiner. These are the specially trained healthcare providers who can actually perform sexual assault forensic medical examinations, right? And do those what we sometimes will refer to as rape kits, right? Or those assessments. And so per, you know, law, you know, in VAWA, it is written that, you know, survivors have the right to of an evidentiary exam, right? And so, you know, in every county, and sometimes tribes have their own SANE nurses or, you know, medical professionals that can do these. But, you know, really the role of this team is to provide an independent forensic examination and to document and somewhat to interpret, you know, some of those findings so that it can be placed for, you know, evidence, right, in terms of the criminal justice system. This is just, again, some language from CalCASA. CalCASA is the California Sexual Assault Response, I'm sorry, the California Sexual Assault State Coalition. So we, you know, at the partnership, we work very closely with CalCASA, as we know, you know, obviously domestic violence and sexual assault, again, are interconnected. But they're, you know, they have many resources and tools in terms of responding to sexual assault, but then also creating SARTs, right? And so this language was taken from their manual, and the mission of SARTs, you know, is to counter the experience of sexual assault with a sensitive and competent multidisciplinary response, and to support efforts to restore well-being to the victim and to bring responsible persons to justice. So again, you know, the main focus is really to, you know, provide the support efforts. You know, when you're looking at the advocate level, it's really to support, to provide that support effort. So again, just acknowledging that, you know, a lot of times the work that I do within Native communities, both rural and urban, a lot of times the gap or the deficiency in response is, you know, that immediate response, right? Or the lack of resources, the lack of collaboration. So, again, I want to emphasize that collaboration really is key, that none of us can do this work by ourselves. And it's important that we keep that in mind because, again, we all hold very different roles. And that would be harming to the survivor if we try to carry on all of those different roles. If any one of us or any one organization were to try to do all of that, it would actually be less beneficial to a survivor. And to, again, it breaks it down here in terms of, this type of response again. And tribes can do this, within their tribe, again, just breaking it down in terms of, not having one role or one advocate or one program doing everything. So I've seen tribes successfully have multidisciplinary collaborations within the tribe. Okay, so these are just some of the SART goals. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I did want to kind of just, I put that visual there just because, again, I'm more of a visual person, so it is important that, that we kind of see that in a different way. But again, looking at, and I think that there's more than obviously these 4 entities in that model, but it is important to acknowledge that, again, you don't just have victim advocates working alone. And I also want to note that, that is for the health and wellness of the victim advocate as well, right? And for each of our programs, because, if we were expected to do all of this alone, and sometimes we are, and we have a lot of burnout and turnover and a lot of different things happening, for advocates as well as a result. This is the penal code that protects confidential communications between a sexual assault survivor and a certified rape counselor. There's a similar penal code, obviously for domestic violence counselors. And I wanted to put this in here because sometimes programs don't understand the difference. And I remember getting a call from a tribe one time and, not understanding why they could not argue for having privilege for their client. And, so I had to explain to them, exactly what a rape counselor was, or a sexual assault counselor, and what a domestic violence counselor was, and why they were not. And not that, that having that privilege means that, they won't have to disclose in court or anything like that, but it just adds some added protection to where sometimes we can often fight that request. So who are, victim advocates? Again, looking at the different programs that I worked with, some of the, the most robust programs have been obviously available 24 hours a day. I worked with programs that, have very limited hours, and a lot of times the need has not happened within those hours, right? And so again, when we're looking at how do we respond most effectively, how do we respond when that need is present, a lot of times that means that we are available 24 hours a day. It's also important to have, diverse responders, right? Different genders, different cultures, that way we can make sure that if there is a specific request or need for a survivor of who they would like to work with, we want them to feel comfortable with who they're working with, right? And sometimes, a lot of times that we have to be careful and we have to make sure we're not taking things personally. A lot, it has more to do with their trauma experience than it does to who we, about who we are. I had a survivor one time, request a male advocate, and and so after a couple of questions, the person doing harm was in fact a female, right? And so sometimes we don't think about that, and we don't think about maybe their past or history in terms of who they're more comfortable with. But that was the case in that situation. So being able to, again, have some diversity and some options for survivors is really important. So just a little bit more about kind of the advocate's role, again, playing that role within SART, looking at follow-up, I was working with the tribal program a couple of years ago, and they did really, really great work for crisis response. And then they stopped any kind of contact with the client after that point. And so when we looked at their program, like there was a huge need for follow-up, right? There's a huge need for follow-up and additional case management for that healing piece and that support post-crisis. So again, looking at that and making sure that programs are holistic, and and if they're not going to offer that holistic piece, then that there's somewhere else that they can get that from, to where there's a warm handoff process, right? And not just necessarily leaving it up to the client to find it or to initiate it. There really does have to be some kind of process for a warm handoff, so that that relationship and trust building is continued and it's on a continuum. Okay, so some things that, of course, there are other things that we recommend shouldn't be done, but, for the most part, these are some of the things that have come up most frequently. And, some of the things that we don't recommend be done by the advocate are, obviously, translation. And interpretation and translation can be a very difficult piece when you're working with, survivors that don't speak English, or I've worked with deaf survivors, and a lot of times I've had advocates, say, well, I can just write things, or I can just, try to get my point across. And again, it's really in the best interest to bring in interpreters that can do that, so that you can remain in the role of support, right? The other piece is, again, legally, we cannot partake in any of the interview process or assist with the evidentiary exam. We want to make sure that if the survivor chooses to carry this forward, that we are not going to harm them in that criminal justice system, right? So if later they find out that we partook in the interview inappropriately, or if we tampered or assisted with that exam, or we made a statement that was not within privilege conversation and so forth, again, we have to think about how we could inadvertently cause harm to that survivor. And then one thing that I constantly am addressing within tribal communities, both in rural and urban areas, again, is remembering boundaries. I know that this can be very challenging, and of course, this does not mean that we cannot be culturally appropriate, because for a lot of times, advocates will be like, well, I go to the client and, they'll offer me food, right? And again, for Native peoples, food is essential. Food is linked to trust building and relationship building, and it's cultural and all of that, gifts as well, right? But looking at policies and looking at structures that we can implement that could allow for those cultural components to happen without eliminating boundaries, right? So I remember I worked for an organization that allowed gifts up to a certain amount, or food, as long as it was there was a conversation in terms of why they're wanting to feed you and what that means, and all of that. So again, having bigger conversations about what these boundaries should be, and then boundaries about surrounding self-care, right? Boundaries surrounding how much we do for a survivor. I know that, myself as a mother, sometimes I'm like, I just want to do this and this, and I want to help do this, and I have to kind of take a step back and look like, okay, how much of it am I empowering them to do this, and how much am I enabling them, right? And how much of it is their choice, and how much of it is me imposing? And so a lot of times when we're looking at boundaries, it's not necessarily to separate that relational piece, but to really allow space for them to make their own choices, and space for their safety and our safety. This is just a tool. I'll include it in the PowerPoint package also. It's a little bit dated, but I enjoy it very much and refer to it, in looking at SARTs within tribal communities. Some challenges. Again, I've kind of mentioned some of these, but you're looking at, again, challenges from survivors, whether it's reporting, whether it's consistency. In tribal communities, a lot of times it's, even if a survivor does report, then sometimes they travel away and we don't necessarily hear from them for a while, right? So sometimes that coordinated response piece doesn't work. Community challenges, you know, with all respect and transparency, in some tribal communities, it is still difficult to talk about these things, right? And so, you know, it's our job for our tribes and for Native organizations and mainstream organizations that are working with Native peoples. You know, it is the responsibility and it is our accountability to provide space to have these conversations, and so that we can, again, work on how we are responding to Native survivors. Of course, criminal justice system challenges, financial challenges. I know that, you know, everything when you say, and again, all of these are so complex. You know, I could talk an hour about each of them. You know, when you look at financial, not only are you looking at the financial piece of, you know, financing an attorney and all of that, but also the financial piece of, okay, if I have to go to all these court dates or I have to go to all these exams and appointments, even the appointments for healing, right? Like, can I take that time off of work? Can I then feed my family if I'm losing out on income? So there's so much complexity even with just that one and with each of these that we need to keep in mind. This video was going to be kind of a brief example of a program, a tribal program working with their sexual assault response, and kind of like, you know, they actually are volunteers, and so looking at why they do the work, particularly one Native woman, she is a survivor and she does this work, you know, as a way to give back and to obviously prevent sexual abuse in Native communities. These are, again, some of the benefits. I'm not going to read through them, but I wanted them to be in here so you can read them later. And then I wanted to, before we end, I wanted to talk, you know, about resiliency. And I know that probably every one of you on this call knows what resiliency is, and, you know, and obviously see it in your communities each and every day. But looking at resiliency, looking at the strengths and, you know, within our communities, within our Native communities, has been really, really a lot of my life work. Looking at how can you implement programs of, you know, where culture is prevention and culture is healing. We're looking at, you know, pieces of the connection between our loss of identity for some of us, right, or for some survivors, loss of identity and that disconnection, and then the connection between healing of their sexual assault. Like, a lot of that becomes very relevant, and a lot of times identity and culture and our community resilience becomes very key pieces of an individual survivor's story. And so, again, keeping in mind and making sure that, you know, although it is sometimes easier for us to talk about the connections between colonization and violence and, you know, impacts of historical trauma and, you know, the barriers today, it is equally important for us to talk about the resiliency piece and how, you know, even the SART model, you know, and things like that, although a lot of the credit is given to mainstream organizations or those currently working within the field, like a lot of those, like that community-driven response and that interdisciplinary approach is very much embedded in Indigenous epistemology, right? You look at tribal epistemology and those types of responses are there. We see it. And so when we really look at that, that's a piece of resiliency that, you know, that protocol and that relationship-based programming and all of that really comes from a traditional perspective. And so I just want to kind of reiterate that it is important for us to not only look at the resiliency of each survivor that we are working with, but the tribal communities and as well as the advocates and, you know, all of us program people too. I listed out some resources for all of you. These are just some. I don't want you know people to think that this is the only list, but I will also include some fact sheets and some reports with this packet when Joy emails it out to all of you. And so with that, I know that I just want to be cognizant of time, and I want to allow some space for conversation and for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint, and any of you who want to type any questions into the chat. Joy is kind of moderating that, and she can throw them out. Okay, I think I stopped sharing. If not, you probably see my very messy desktop.
You did stop sharing.
Okay.
I just wanted to pop on here so I could help you out a little bit. So we'll give everybody a couple of minutes to see if they have any questions that we can read out.
I also just want to acknowledge that, yeah, questions in the chat are fine, I don't mind, but then also I know that sometimes questions can be complex, and maybe you want to ask a question that's very specific to your program, and my email will be on the slide that you receive, the PowerPoint, and so you're welcome to reach out to me individually as well after this webinar.
Awesome. You know what we can do too is I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. So if you want to remain muted, you can go ahead and mute yourself back. Sandra, did you have a question?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, yes, I want to thank the presenter for all this great information. And I also wanted to ask, is it possible to use part of this presentation in our presentations?
Yeah, absolutely. When you get the PowerPoint, that's why I kind of just in the beginning disclosed that, this is kind of a collective presentation of some of the
Yeah, I mean, that sounds good to me. That's kind of what we did here with our Tuesday meetings. We started an agenda just because we wanted to, have that structure, but still have that free-flowing conversation integrated into it, allowing that space as well. So I think that would be great if we work on that together. And yeah, I mean, do you want me to send you the agenda that we have?
You can if you'd like, or I can, like I said, like the PowerPoint that I share, it's, again, I don't own the information or anything, and I want it to be utilized if it's going to be helpful. So you don't really need
I mean, it's
to check
pretty
in with
simple, but I'll send you the kind of the way, that way you guys also have an understanding of how we're running our Tuesday meeting as well. And you can always document that if you'd like to.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, so what I'm going to do, Cibonay, I don't think I mentioned this to you before, is we're going to stop the recording so that if anybody has a question they want to ask offline, it's going to just take me a minute to get there. Oh, I see there's a question in the...
Yeah, and that too, we wanted to, like you said, build that relationship, kind of get to know each other and seeing how we can all work together first, and then, slowly start adding more people and, yeah.
Did you get that, Cibonay?
In terms of the presentation? Whoever was talking kind of cut out on my end.
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, so that's still the link that we're using. The one that you've been posting and showing people. I don't know if you have that in a document, but that's I guess outdated, you would say, because we're constantly making updates to it day by day. And so when we're with the consultants, me and Hane are in there making those edits and adding all of that, and we share our screen so that everybody can see it. And yeah, we did send that link to Shelby and to Amy as well, so that they can get familiar with with what we already have.
Okay, that's great. Again, yeah, you're welcome to use whatever you'd like, and I think that's great that you're providing that space and you know, and sharing that information.
Hi, Cibonay, this is Linda.
Hey, Linda.
Hey, there's a question in the box and it says, what are good first steps for starting a SART team or finding one in your area?
So yeah, so first steps, there are, you know, the California, CalCASA, the California Sexual Assault Coalition, they work pretty much with most SARTs in California. So I would say a first step would be to contact them and let them know kind of what area you're in, which communities you're working with, and they can help you identify, you know, specifically what is available already in your area. Because again, you don't want to necessarily duplicate services unless you have a different mission or goal, right? And or if something is going to be culturally specific. And again, when we're working with Native people, sometimes that is the best practice, is that we do things apart from whatever mainstream SART is available in that county or area. So it just really depends, and that's why a lot of these things, it is really important that we have specific conversations about what your community needs. And, you know, maybe a community needs assessment might also be something that is a first step in conjunction with finding out what resources are available. But I would say, and CalCASA actually has a community needs assessment tool that can be used to kind of figure out the readiness of your community. I have found that we're working both in tribal communities.
For looking out for us. We appreciate that.
I'm sorry, okay, let me, so doing a readiness assessment and then also contacting CalCASA would be helpful. And then of course, after that, kind of assessing what is still available, like where the gaps are. So, and if you need that, CalCASA can also do that, but you can also reach out to me.
I feel like
and I can kind of help with some of those steps as well.
Thank you, Cibonay. I hope that answered your question, Jessica.
Yes, thank you. Okay, does anybody else have a question? I'm trying to look at all the hands to see if anybody has a hand risen. Okay, we're going to stop the recording briefly to see if anybody has a question that they want to ask off camera and off of the recording. So give me 1 second.